Before the guillotine could claim her, Marie Antoinette faced a final, deliberate act of cruelty designed to strip away everything that defined her as a queen, a mother, and a woman. Her harrowing journey from the gilded halls of Versailles to a bare wooden cart paraded through the streets of Paris was not just punishment. It was a psychological assault intended to erase her existence. Yet, despite months of calculated humiliation, she found a sliver of power in her final hours. This is the story of how they attempted to destroy Marie Antoinette, and how, even in utter degradation, she regained her dignity. Forget the sparkling salons of Versailles. This tale begins in the damp, stinking cell of the conciergerie, a grim fortress nicknamed the antechamber to the guillotine. By August 2, 1793, Marie Antoinette had already spent months imprisoned alongside her family, stripped of her crown and wealth. That night, she was torn from her children and her sister-in-law and brought here alone to a room that would be her world for the next 76 days. In this cell, she was no longer a queen, but was reduced to prisoner number 2. The space was tiny and filthy, with walls that leaked and a straw mattress barely enough to call a bed. Privacy was non-existent. 2 guards were stationed in her cell 24/7, watching her every movement, eating, dressing behind a flimsy screen, even trying to sleep. This constant surveillance was not only intimidating but a methodical attack on her humanity, a reminder that the privileges of royalty were gone forever. The physical misery was brutal, but nothing compared to the psychological torment. Just a month earlier, guards had stormed her room in the dead of night to seize her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. Accounts described Marie Antoinette throwing herself between her son and the men, screaming and pleading, while her daughter, Madame Royale, clung to Louis, crying. They tore him away regardless. She would never see him alive again. All that remained was a tiny portrait and a lock of his hair hidden in her corset. Losing the crown was secondary. Losing her child shattered her in a way that no execution could. Her maid, Rosalie Lamolle, who remained with her during these harrowing months, would later say that the Queen's heart broke only when she spoke of her children. Every other humiliation, every insult, felt almost tolerable compared to that grief. By mid-October, the final act of her ordeal approached. On October 14, 1793, Marie Antoinette faced a revolutionary tribunal. This was no real trial. It was a grim performance scripted by her political enemies. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who had weeks to mount a defense, she was allowed less than a day. The charges against her were absurd, a grotesque mixture of political accusations and slanderous fantasies that had haunted her for years. She was accused of funneling money to Austria, plotting massacres, and hosting depraved orgies at Versailles. The most insidious accusation claimed incest with her own son, forcing young Louis Charles to sign a statement against her. As the courtroom fell silent, Marie Antoinette absorbed this monstrous lie. The prosecution, led by the zealot Antoine Quentin Fouquet-Tinville, seemed almost giddy at the cruelty. For a moment she didn't speak. The room buzzed with tension. Then she rose, not to plead or beg, but to confront this last accusation with a presence that shocked everyone. She turned to the gallery, her eyes scanning the faces of Parisian women who had once shouted for her death. With that bold gaze, she reminded them and the world that she was a mother first, a woman defending her honor. The trial was over quickly. On October 16th, within barely 2 days, the all-male jury declared her guilty of high treason, sentencing her to death by guillotine. When asked for her last words, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head. Back in her cell, she refused a final meal. Calmly, she told Rosalie, "I need nothing now, my child. It's all over for me." Then she penned a heartbreaking letter to her sister-in-law, pleading that her son be forgiven for the forced testimony against her. This letter was intercepted and discovered years later. At dawn came the next wave of humiliation, meticulously planned. Guards ordered her to remove the black mourning dress she had worn since Louis XVI's execution, a garment that had symbolized her status and history. In its place, they forced her into a tattered white shirt, the garb of a penitent rather than a queen. She had to beg for a moment of privacy to dress. When her captives ignored her protest, she initially refused to comply, a small act of control in a day designed to strip her of any autonomy. The executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, and his assistants took further steps to dehumanize her. An assistant brutally cut her already prematurely white hair with crude scissors, symbolically erasing her femininity and rank, all while preparing her for the guillotine. Her hands were bound painfully behind her back. Even basic bodily functions required permission, which she had to request with humility. As she was led to a wooden cart typically used for common criminals, unlike her husband's closed carriage, she was exposed to the jeers and hatred of tens of thousands lining the streets. The parade to the Place de la Révolution would take more than an hour, a public spectacle of degradation meant to crush her spirit. Yet, as she sat on that plank, hands tied and surrounded by hostility, Marie Antoinette endured. Every taunt, every stare, every insult tested her, but she remained composed, aware that her final hours would define her more than any trial or punishment. The Queen of France had been stripped of her crown, her family, and her palace. But in that damp cell and on the path to the guillotine, the seeds of her final unbroken dignity were already taking root. Marie Antoinette's silent defiance during the ride foreshadowed an astonishing display of courage that would stun both the executioners and the spectators. The crowd's mood was volatile, swinging between satisfaction, hatred, and morbid curiosity. Some cheered, some spat, while others simply stared. Every insult hurled at her was an effort to crush her spirit before the blade finished the job. Yet, with each jolt of the cart, each scream from the crowd, Marie Antoinette held on to her composure, revealing that while she had lost everything material, her inner core remained intact. This hour-long procession through the heart of Paris was designed to dehumanize her, to transform her into a symbol of the revolution's triumph over royalty. Yet, ironically, it solidified her legend. In her quiet defiance, unshakable dignity, and motherly courage, she demonstrated that even in her final public moments, she would not be diminished. When the cart finally reached the Place de la Révolution, Marie Antoinette had survived an ordeal that would shatter any ordinary person. But as the guillotine loomed, she understood that another wave of humiliation awaited her, a moment where she would face not just death, but the ultimate test of her composure, courage, and humanity. That final act, her ascent up the wooden steps to the blade, would unveil a side of her that even the revolutionaries could not destroy. The Queen's capacity for grace, defiance, and a hauntingly human act would echo through history. On that October day in 1793, the atmosphere was charged, a cauldron of rage, curiosity, and bloodlust surrounded the guillotine. Its wooden frame towering against the gray autumn sky, a silent predator awaiting its prey. The crowd surged like a living tide, tens of thousands strong, yearning for spectacle, eager for the downfall of the Queen who had become a symbol of everything they despised. Yet, as the cart jerked to a halt, something unexpected occurred. Marie Antoinette, stripped of every luxury, every title, and every shred of dignity, did not crumble. She stepped down with measured composure. Observers later described her demeanor as calm, almost elegant. Bound hands, hair once regal now shorn, she remained unyielding. Every insult seemed to roll off her shoulders. The wooden steps of the guillotine awaited her. It would have been easy, ordinary, even to collapse, to tremble, to scream. But she didn't. She climbed the steps alone, refusing the executioner's hand, rejecting that final act of subjugation. Each step became a silent defiance, a reminder that while they could end her life, they could not crush her spirit. In a moment almost too surreal to believe, she stepped on the executioner's foot. Charles Henry Sanson, the man who had severed her hair, bound her hands, and was now seconds away from taking her life, flinched. Tension gripped the crowd, their eyes fixed on this unexpected moment. Marie Antoinette, displaying no fear, whispered a quiet apology. "Forgive me, sir. I didn't mean to. That small act, mere seconds before death, was extraordinary. It was human. It was graceful. It was defiant in the only way that truly mattered." She retained her dignity when all else had been stripped away. The guillotine would take her life, but not her essence. At precisely 12:15 p.m., it happened. The blade fell swift, precise, final. The assistant held her severed head aloft, and the crowd erupted in a roar, chanting, "Long live the Republic!" Her body was unceremoniously loaded onto a cart and dumped into an unmarked grave at a nearby cemetery. In death, they attempted to reduce her to a common criminal, trying to erase the last Queen of France as if she had never existed. Yet history has a way of preserving what cruelty seeks to destroy. Even in death, Marie Antoinette's story refused to be silenced. One of the macabre tales that followed her was that of the young artist who would become Madame Tussaud. She was summoned to create a death mask of the Queen, as severed had a chilling reminder of the fascination and horror that Marie Antoinette inspired even in the wake of her life. It would take more than 20 years for her final chapter to be written. After the monarchy's restoration in 1815, King Louis XVIII ordered the exhumation of the remains of his brother and sister-in-law. Their clothing was identified and their bodies received a proper royal burial in the Basilica of St. Denis, the traditional resting place of French royalty. Finally, the Queen, who had been publicly humiliated and executed as a commoner, was laid to rest with the dignity she had been denied in life. The French Revolution sought to destroy a symbol of wealth and excess. They subjected Marie Antoinette to every conceivable indignity, imprisonment, the loss of her children, a sham trial, public humiliation, and finally a death that aimed to strip her of her very identity. They wanted the world to see a monster. Instead, they revealed a woman of remarkable endurance, courage, and unexpected grace. Her last moments contained acts of subtle defiance that history still remembers: the apology to her executioner, her refusal to collapse, and her composure in the face of hatred and antagonism. All were demonstrations that even in the face of ultimate cruelty, she could assert control over her final narrative. They could take her crown. They could take her life. They could even strip her of her hair, clothing, and dignity. But they could not erase the quiet strength, the motherly courage, and the haunting poise displayed until the very end. The guillotine may have been swift, brutal, and public, but it could not sever her story from history. Accounts from witnesses, sketches by revolutionary artists, and later biographies ensured that the final Queen of France would not vanish into obscurity. The image that remained was not that of a debauched, heartless woman, but of a mother, a prisoner, and a human being confronting death with extraordinary composure. Even centuries later, her story continues to captivate. It is not only the brutality of the French Revolution that people remember, but the way she faced it, dignity intact, humanity preserved. The world saw her executed, humiliated, stripped of everything. Yet they also witnessed a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let hatred and fear define her final moments. That final apology, a small but significant act of kindness, became a symbol of her enduring spirit. She could die, but she could not be destroyed. The legend of Marie Antoinette is not merely about excess or monarchy. It is about survival, grace under pressure, and the stubbornness of the human spirit in the face of dehumanization. Every cruel act, every humiliation intended to diminish her instead highlighted the unbreakable strength that remained. Even as the blade fell, her story refused to end with the violence of the revolution. She was more than the sum of her misfortunes. She was a queen stripped bare, a mother grieving for her child, a human being meeting death with dignity. And in that, she left a legacy no guillotine could erase. The last Queen of France died as they intended, but in the hearts and minds of the witnesses, and throughout the annals of history, Marie Antoinette remained untouchable. Thank you for watching. If you want to uncover more stories of power, betrayal, and survival from the darkest chapters of history, subscribe to Grim History and witness the human stories behind the events that shaped our world.